Therefore, he was watching from an LCI 6 kilometers out, not seeing much because of the smoke and haze. The hands on my watch would not move. He wrote that the time from 6:30 until we landed at 10:30 was the longest 4 hours I ever spent. The 12th was supposed to land north of the ETH, but the coxswains followed the orders from Roosevelt to bring the follow-up waves in behind the ETH regiment, which put the 12th 2 kilometers south of where it was expected to be. "It doesn't matter," Colonel Rita declared when he discovered the error. "We know where to go." Rita led his men through a hole in the seawall to the top of the dune, where he saw Roosevelt. "Look at it!" Roosevelt yelled. "The causeways leading inland are all clogged up." Roosevelt looked tired, and the cane he leaned on heightened the impression. Rita's immediate objective was Senior Trooper Martin d'Everville, where he hoped to effect a link-up with the 82nd Airborne. Off to his right was Exit 4, the one his regiment had been scheduled to use. But the east end of Exit 2 had not been secured and was coming under fire from German artillery to the north. The battery of 4 155 mm cannons at Senior Trooper Maroof could move his regiment right to the causeway and then use it to cross the flooded fields. However, if he did that, his men would be exposed and under observation. Using Causeway 2 was out of the question. It was jammed with jeeps, tanks, trucks and troops. His option was to cross the inundated area to reach Senior Trooper Martin d'Everville. Rita made his decision. "We're going through the flooded area," he yelled. He saw Lieutenant Colonel Charles Chuck Jackson of his 1st Battalion and gave him an arm signal. Jackson had just made the same judgment and set off immediately. Sergeant Clifford Senson, who was with Jackson, recalled that aerial reconnaissance had estimated the flooded area to be ankle-deep, except in the irrigation ditches, which were estimated to be about 18 inches deep. "Well, they made a big mistake," Senson said. "The flooded area was, in some places, up to your waist, and the irrigation ditches were over your head. Some brave souls swam across the irrigation ditches, threw toggle ropes back, and hauled the rest of the men across. So much for aerial reconnaissance." The battalion marched through the inundated fields for nearly 2 kilometers. "We waited and waited and waited," Senson said. An occasional sniper shot would be fired, but didn't hit anybody. They were mostly interested in keeping from drowning because the bottom was slick and the footing tricky. You could slip down and maybe drown with all that equipment. Senson was so angry that the Navy had tried to drown him at the beach, and now the Army was trying to drown him in the flooded area. He was more mad at his own side than he was at the Germans, because the Germans hadn't done anything to him yet. It took 3 to 4 hours or more to get across, but it was accomplished without loss. When the battalion reached the high ground, Rita signalled Jackson to turn right and proceed to Senior Trooper Martin d'Everville. The battalion reached a crossroads where it received some artillery fire that sent the men scattering for cover. General Roosevelt came up. He had hitched a ride on the hood of a jeep that had brought him in on Causeway 2. Roosevelt spotted Colonel Jackson. "Well, Chuck, how are things going?" he asked. Jackson explained the situation. "Let's go up to the front," Roosevelt suggested. "We are at the front," Jackson replied. "See those 2 men about 50 meters away? They are the leading scouts of Company A." "Let's go talk to them," Roosevelt said. They did, got the scouts moving, and the battalion followed. By late afternoon, the 8th Infantry and its supporting regiment, the 22nd, had hooked up with the 82nd Airborne at Senior Trooper Martin d'Everville and Senior Trooper Jaman d'Everville. They bivouacked for the night, somewhat short of their D-Day objective, but pleased to be inland and in contact with the 82nd. The 12th Infantry, meanwhile, had reached its D-Day objective. Captain Marr had moved the lead elements through Marie-Dumont to take up an overnight position north of La Forge. Company K sent a reconnaissance platoon forward to Chef Dupont to establish contact with the 82nd Airborne. By dusk, the 12th was in contact with both paratroop divisions. Much of the success achieved by the attacking battalions was due in part to the support of the Navy. Warships and forward observers had accompanied the 4th Division men inland, and whenever they ran into enemy artillery or tanks, They called back to the battleships and cruisers for suppressing fire. Spotter planes did the same. The Navy poured it on. Lieutenant Ross Olson was a gunnery officer on the Nevada. I recall that our 5-inch guns fired so much that the paint peeled off the guns, and all that was left showing was the blue steel. We also had to halt the guns for a while to clear the deck of empty shell casings. Normally these were saved for reloading, but this day they were dumped over the side as they were hindering the movement of the gun turrets. On one occasion, Nevada got a target that required all its guns, the 14-inch as well as the 5-inch, to fire almost straight ahead. When Nevada unleashed the volley, it cost Olson his hearing in his right ear and 50% of his left. He has worn hearing aids ever since. The shelling also destroyed the 26-foot motor whaleboat on the boat deck, knocked the door off the mess hall, peeled all the insulation material off the mess hall bulkhead, and broke almost every light bulb in the overhead fixtures on the port side. Badly wounded men, German as well as American, were being brought out to the big ships by the returning landing craft. Pharmacist mate Vince Del Giudi was on the Bayfield. He was busy all day tending to many men, but 2 stuck especially in his mind. One was a Mexican-American GI who had the terrible experience of stepping on 2 S-mines simultaneously. German medics had treated him by putting tourniquets on both legs and both arms, but they had been driven off by an American patrol and left him in the field. He was picked up by some GI stretcher-bearers and transported back to the Bayfield, but they had failed to remove the tourniquets and gangrene had set in. Del Giudi assisted in amputating one leg below the knee, the other above, and both arms. The soldier also had abdominal wounds, which Del Giudi debrided. It was a sad sight, Del Giudi said. The man did not complain. He had a look of resignation on him. He came out of his anesthesia, looked at his 4 stumps, closed his eyes, and went back to sleep. Later, Del Giudi tended a wounded German corporal, a tall, thin, rather handsome chap with blonde hair. He had been wounded on his right hand, and all 5 fingers were dangling, and his hand and fingers were blackened. Del Giudi amputated his fingers with scissors, put sulphur powder on his hand, and for his effort he got a smile and a Danke schön. Lieutenant Janker was in an improvised dugout on the dunes, firing with his rifle at the incoming Americans. A tank spotted him and blasted the dugout with its 75 mm cannon. Janker was buried alive. He felt someone dragging him out. It was a GI. Janker had won an Iron Cross on the Eastern Front. His instinct was to get away rather than face captivity. He saw a machine pistol on the ground and dove for it. The American pushed it aside and, in a calm voice, said, "Take it easy, German." The GI sent Janker, hands clasped over his head, to a prisoner of war enclosure on the beach. There, Janker was wounded again by shrapnel from an incoming German shell. CB Oral Wakefield was up by the seawall. He said that by mid-afternoon the beach had changed from nothing but obstacles to a small city. It was apparent that the NCD units had done their job well, because, as far as he could see, to one side, the beach was all the way open. There was nothing holding the landing craft back. We figured our day was well spent, even though no one ever knew who we were. They were being questioned. "Who are you guys? What do you do?" The coxswains didn't like them because they always had so many explosives with them. When they were inland, the army officers wanted to know, "What is the Navy doing in here?" An army medical officer spotted Wakefield's team and said he needed volunteers to carry wounded men down to the shore for evacuation to a hospital ship. He said, "Are you guys going to just sit here, or are you going to volunteer?" They didn't think much about that idea. They had just come off the hot end of the demolition wire. But finally they did volunteer. They carried the wounded down to the shore. German shells were still coming in. By this time Wakefield noted it was no longer a rush of men coming ashore. It was a rush of vehicles. Then he saw a never-to-be-forgotten sight. All of a sudden it seemed like a cloud started from the horizon over the ocean and came toward them. By the time it got to them, it extended clean back to the horizon. Reinforcements were pouring in from the sea and from the air. Utah Beach was secure. In the morning, the Americans would move out to cut the base of the Cotentin, to take Cherbourg, and to get on with the job of winning the war so they could go home. At dusk, Wakefield had one of his most important thoughts that day, waiting in chest-deep water. At first light that morning, he found that his legs would hardly hold him up. He thought he was a coward. Then he discovered that his sea bags, filled with explosives, had filled with water, and he was carrying well over 100 pounds. He used his knife to cut the bags and dump the water, then moved on to do his job. When I had thought for a moment that I wasn't going to be able to do it, that I was a coward, and then found out that I could do it, you can't imagine how great a feeling that was, just finding out, yes, I could do what I had volunteered to do. Overall, casualties were astonishingly light. The ETH and 22nd Regiments had only 12 men killed and another 106 wounded. For the 12th Regiment, the figure was 69 casualties, nearly all caused by mines, either sea or land, mostly those devilish S-mines. The 4th Division had taken heavier losses in training and in the disaster at Slapton Sands. It lost almost 20 times as many men as it did on June 6th. Equally amazing was the speed with which the 4th Division and its attached units got ashore. This was thanks to the organisation, training and skill of all those involved, whether Army, Navy, Army Air Force or Coast Guard. They overcame logistical problems that seemed insurmountable on D-Day. In 15 hours, the Americans put ashore at Utah more than 20,000 troops and 1,700 motorized vehicles. General Jodl had estimated that it would take the Allies 6 or 7 days to put 3 divisions into France. At Utah alone, counting the airborne divisions, the Americans had done it in 1 day. D-Day was a smashing success for the 4th Division and its attached units. Nearly all objectives were attained, even though the plan had to be abandoned before the first assault waves hit the beach. By nightfall, the division was ready to move out at first light on June 7th for its next mission, taking Montebourg and then moving on to Cherbourg. The division went on to fight battles far more costly than the one at Conan Beach on June 6th, distinguishing itself throughout the campaign in northwest Europe. Notable achievements included taking Cherbourg, holding off the German counter-offensive at Mortain, liberating Paris, fighting in the Hurtgen forest, and participating in the Battle of the Bulge. Several factors contributed to the 4th Division's success on D-Day. Among them was the German reliance on mines, flooded areas, and fixed fortifications, rather than high-quality troops to defend the supposedly impregnable Atlantic Wall. Equally important were the air and sea bombardments and naval shelling throughout the day. Credit also goes to General Roosevelt and his colonels, men like Van Fleet, Rita, and Jackson, for making quick and correct decisions. Junior officers, including Captains Arne and Marr, made indispensable contributions. However, the success of the 4th Division was most of all thanks to the airborne troopers behind the German lines. The paratroopers held the western exits, confused the Germans, and prevented any concentrated counterattacks aimed at the seaborne invaders. They neutralized batteries that might have brought heavy artillery fire down on Utah Beach. The airborne troops faced significant challenges. At dawn, the men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were scattered in small pockets throughout an area stretching 10 km southwest from the mouth of the Du River to the northern edge of Quentin, then 20 km northwest from Quentin to Pont-la, and finally 20 km northeast to the coast near Raveneville. Unit cohesion was almost non-existent, with most paratroopers in groups of 6 to 50 men, sometimes with all officers or all enlisted men. The groups were often mixed, containing men from different companies, battalions, regiments, and even divisions, unfamiliar with their leaders and objectives. As a result, the airborne troops fought numerous unconnected engagements, many of them fights for survival rather than planned objectives. Despite the chaos, the confusion among Americans worked to their advantage as the Germans grossly overestimated the size of the force attacking them and struggled to get coherent or useful information from prisoner interrogations. Thanks to the initiative of various Americans, general officers, junior officers, NCOs, and enlisted men, The 82nd and 101st managed to overcome most of their difficulties and complete critical missions, such as the seizure of St. Mary Eglis and securing the exits from Utah. The way it was done, however, was hardly textbook or in accordance with the plan. There was virtually no overall control because it was impossible for generals and colonels to give orders to units that had not yet formed up. The groups that had come together were unaware of their locations or those of other groups, a problem greatly compounded by the lack of effective radio communication. Many radios were damaged or lost in the drop, and those that worked were inadequate. The SCR Signal Corps radio -300, weighing 32 pounds, had a speaking range of 5 miles under perfect conditions. The much more common SCR 536, weighing only 6 pounds and known as a walkie-talkie, had a range of less than 1 mile and was easily jammed by the Germans. Sergeant Leonard Lebanon, part of General Ridgway's headquarters group, described the situation as chaotic. The command post was trying to be a directional centre, but was not truly in control of anything. They were just gathering information and waiting for things to develop. Ridgway, a very brave and forceful man, was continually on the move, but the command post lacked proper functionality. Private John Delury of the 5008P remembered a brief sense of euphoria at dawn as the dreaded night was over and he was still alive. However, this feeling was short-lived, as the arrival of morning meant losing the concealment afforded by the night. With the Germans possessing the communications, transportation, tanks and artillery, once they located the paratroopers, they would be surrounded and overwhelmed. Consequently, their actions were evasive. They would move in one direction, engage the Germans, and then retreat, continually searching for their own regiment or any sizable friendly force. Sergeant D.Z. Schull of the 5008P experienced each field as a separate battleground, feeling intense isolation. He found an unusual ally in the Norman cattle. The presence of grazing cows indicated that the field was likely not mined. The cows' curiosity also helped identify anyone else in the field. Despite this, the cows could only spot Germans and not eliminate them. By mid-morning of D-Day, more troopers had assembled, but they had limited resources: a few machine guns, bazookas, radios, medical supplies and medics. Most had only grenades and rifles. Nonetheless, their aggressive spirit and can-do attitude persisted. Sergeant Sidney Mallam of the 006th engaged in a typical hedgerow fight with Sergeant William Adley beside him. When a German machine gun fired on them, Mallam and Adley dove to the ground. Adley was hit in the head, but expressed confidence that they would win the war. When the firing ceased, Adley was dead. Mallam concluded his story with a reflection on the extraordinary effort beyond the call of duty. The northern exits from Utah, a kilometre or so inland from the beach, were critical. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole of the 5002P commanded the 3rd Battalion and was the first to reach these exits. After landing near St. Martin, he collected a group of about 75 men from his battalion, others from the 56th P, and a few from the 82nd Airborne. He moved out towards St. Martin de Varil, had a skirmish with a German patrol, killed several enemies, and took 10 prisoners. Cole then split his force, sending one group to seize Exit 3 and another to take Exit 4. By 9:30 a.m. near Odil Lao, the Americans saw German troops retreating across the causeway from the beach. Without losing any men, the Americans killed 50 to 75 of the enemy. By noon, the exits were securely in American hands. Captain L. Legs Johnson led a patrol down the causeway to the beach, where he saw German soldiers waving a white flag. They were part of the Coastal Defence Group, relatively older and less competent soldiers. Johnson accepted their surrender, allowing them to come up only in small groups and enclosing them with their own barbed wire. He was surprised by the number of prisoners and noted the contrast with the arriving American infantry, who were ready for action. Johnson quickly pointed them inland, about a kilometre from St. Martin de Varil, where there was a German coastal artillery barracks known from its map designation as WXYZ. Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Cassidy, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 5002P, short of men and with various missions, sent Sergeant Harrison Summers of West Virginia with 15 men to capture the barracks. Despite the small force, Summers set out immediately, leaving behind most of his men. He charged the first farmhouse alone, killed 4 Germans, and inspired Private William Burt to provide suppressing fire against the barracks. Summers continued his assault, killing 6 Germans and driving the remainder out. Out of the building, Summers dropped to the ground, exhausted and in emotional shock. He rested for half an hour while his squad came up and replenished his ammunition supply. As he rose to continue, an unknown captain from the 1001 MISD approached. Miles appeared at his side and said, "I'll go with you." At that instant, the captain was shot through the heart, leaving Summers alone once more. He charged another building, killing 6 more Germans. The rest threw up their hands in surrender. Summers's squad was close behind, and he turned the prisoners over to his men. One of the prisoners, Private John Kamen from New York City, called out to Summers, "Why are you doing this?" "I can't tell you," Summers replied. "What about the others? They don't seem to want to fight," Kamen said. "And I can't make them, so I've got to finish it," Summers responded. "Okay," said Kamen. "I'm with you." Together, Summers and Kamen moved from building to building, taking turns charging and giving covering fire. Burt, meanwhile, moved up with his machine gun. Between the 3 of them, they killed more Germans. There were 2 buildings left to clear. Summers charged the first one and kicked the door open to see the most improbable sight. 15 German artillerymen were seated at mess tables eating breakfast. Summers didn't pause. He shot them down at the tables. The last building was the largest. Beside it was a shed and a haystack. Burt used tracer bullets to set them ablaze. The shed, used by the Germans for ammunition storage, exploded, driving 30 Germans out into the open, where Summers, Kamon and Burt shot some of them down as the others fled. Another member of Summers's makeshift squad arrived with a bazooka, which he used to set the roof of the last building on fire. The Germans on the ground floor were firing a steady fusillade from loopholes in the walls, but as the flames built, they dashed out. Many died in the open, and 31 others emerged with raised hands to surrender. Summers collapsed, exhausted by nearly 5 hours of combat. He lit a cigarette. When one of the men asked how he felt, Summers replied, "Not very good. It was all kind of crazy. I'm sure I'll never do anything like that again." Summers received a battlefield commission and a Distinguished Service Cross. He was put in for the Medal of Honor, but the paperwork got lost. In the late 1980s, after Summers's death from cancer, Private Baker and others tried to get the medal awarded posthumously, but without success. Summers remains a legend among American paratroopers, often referred to as the Sergeant York of World War II. His story has a Hollywood quality to it, yet more than 10 men witnessed and reported his exploits. At 6 a.m., General Taylor made his first D-Day command decision. With him were Brigadier General Anthony McKeff, 101st Artillery Commander Colonel Julian Ulico, 3rd Battalion 51st P, 18 other officers, and 40 men. With sunrise, Taylor could see the church steeple at Saint-Marie-du-Mont. "I know the shape of that one," he said, a payoff from the pre-invasion briefing. He was in position to move his group south to defend the line of the Douve River, or east to exits 1 and 2. Either way, he would be carrying out 101st missions. He decided to go east. "It remains for us to help the 4th Infantry Division in every way possible," he said. He set off from just south of Saint-Marie-du-Mont for Poopville, called Poopville by the GIs, and Exit 1. Lieutenant Eugene Breyer led the way with flank guards on both sides. As they approached Poopville, shots rang out. The village was held by about 60 men of the German 91st Division. They were hunkered down, occasionally firing from second-story windows. It took Taylor's small force nearly 3 hours to complete the house-to-house, window-to-window fighting. U's battalion suffered 18 casualties and inflicted 25 on the enemy. Nearly 40 German troops surrendered. In one house, Breyer found a wounded German on the floor with his gun nearby. "I almost shot him when I realized he was seriously wounded. He signalled me to hand him something. I saw that he was pointing toward a rosary. I grabbed his gun, unloaded it, threw it aside, picked up the rosary, and handed it to him. He had a look of deep appreciation in his eyes and began to pray, passing the beads through his fingers. He died shortly thereafter. With Poopville taken, Taylor had possession of Exit 1. He sent Lieutenant Breyer on an 8-man patrol down the causeway with orders to make contact with the 4th Infantry Division coming in at Utah. A couple of German soldiers had fled Poopville towards the beach, and 4 German soldiers at Utah had fled inland along the causeway. When they realized they were caught in a nutcracker, they hid under a bridge. Meanwhile, Captain Marr was advancing inland along the causeway. Breyer shot an orange flare into the air to signal that they were friends. The troops came on, and when they reached the bridge, 6 Germans emerged with their hands up and surrendered. Breyer met Captain Marr and recorded the time, 11:10 a.m. The link-up at Poopville was complete. Breyer took Marr to meet Taylor. When Marr informed Taylor how smoothly the landings at Utah were going, Taylor turned to his Chief of Staff, Colonel Gerald Higgins, and said, "The invasion is succeeding. We don't have to worry about the causeways now. We can think about the next move." When the German 6th Parachute Regiment moved out to attack, it was hit almost immediately by naval gunfire. "No one can imagine what it was like," Private Egon RAR declared. "When the ships fired, it was like a storm. It was hell, and it lasted. It was unendurable. We lay on the ground pressed against the earth." Private Wolfgang Garrett Slur, in Rose's unit, had spent 2 years worrying that the war would end before he could participate. "But at the end of 1 hour, I wanted only to go home. We were all terrified. There were some who cried and called for their mothers." Colonel Heiter wanted to see the situation for himself, so he set off on his motorcycle and drove from Caran to Saint-Marie-du-Mont, where he climbed to the top of the church steeple, the one Taylor had spotted an hour earlier. It was 50 meters above the ground and gave him a magnificent view of Utah Beach. What he saw took his breath away. All along the beach, he recalled, were these small boats, hundreds of them, each discharging 30 or 40 armed men. Behind them were the warships blasting away with their huge guns, more warships in one fleet than anyone had ever seen before. Cannons from a single German coastal bunker were firing at the incoming American troops, who had no cover on the gently rising slope except for a small fortification. The German defence seemed non-existent, or in any case invisible. Around the church, in the little village and beyond, in the green fields criss-crossed by hedgerows, all was quiet. The Germans had a battery of 4 105 mm cannons at Breau Manor, a couple of kilometres north of Saint-Marie-du-Mont, but the guns were not firing, even though they were perfectly situated to lob shells onto the landing craft at Utah and to engage the warships in the channel. An identical battery at Holdy, just south of Saint-Marie-du-Mont, was also not firing. No one ever found out why. As with the Germans eating breakfast when summers burst in on them, it was and remains inexplicable. Of course, these artillerymen were not top-quality troops, nothing to match Hayter's paratroopers. Many were over age, some were just kids, and few had any heart for fighting American paratroopers. But the biggest problem was the absence of leadership. The junior officers and non-coms in the artillery units either would not or could not take charge and make their men do their duty. They were prepared to defend themselves from their trenches, bunkers, and stone farmhouses, but not to stand to their guns. Here dashed down the circular stairs from the steeple and got on his radio. He ordered his 1st Battalion to get to Saint-Marie-du-Mont and Holdy as quickly as possible to hold the villages and get those guns shooting. Thus did the Wehrmacht pay the price for overextending itself. Its best troops were either dead, prisoners of war, invalids, or fighting on the Eastern Front. The garrison troops in the Cotentin were almost useless, even a detriment. Hayter's clear mission was to open the road from Cantin to Saint-Marie-du-Mont, concentrate his regiment to drive the small 80th Airborne Force in Saint-Marie-du-Mont out of town, and, by such a counter-attack, throw the Americans on the defensive. That was what he had intended to do, but the sad state of affairs at the batteries at Breau Manor and Holdy forced him to disband his force and put one of his battalions on a defensive mission. Here was the only German regimental commander doing his job that morning. The others were running the war game. This was one reason for the failure of the Wehrmacht to launch any coordinated counterattacks, even though it had been preparing for this day for the past 6 months, and even though Rommel had insisted on the absolute necessity of immediate strong counterattacks while the invaders were still on the beaches. The game at Rennes was only one small part of the abysmal failure of the Wehrmacht paralysis. The High Command's paralysis permeated everything. The BBC radio messages to the French resistance were more or less ignored. For this failure, at least there was an excuse. There had been so many false alarms in the preceding weeks that the German coastal units had become exhausted and exasperated by the continuous alerts. Further, the messages did not indicate where the invasion was coming. The dummy paratroopers dropped by the SAS convinced some German commanders that the whole operation was a bluff. But the major factor in the Wehrmacht's failure appears to have been a consequence of the soft life of occupation. As early as 6:15 a.m., General Max Pemsel, Chief of Staff to General Dolan's 7th Army, told General Speidel at La Roguang of the massive air and naval bombardment. A half-hour later, Pemsel reported to Run's headquarters that the landings were beginning, but he added that the 7th Army would be able to cope with the situation from its own resources. With that news, General Smouth, commanding the 15th Army, went back to bed, as did Speidel and most of Rommel's staff at La Roguang. General Blumentritt from Run's headquarters told General Jodl at Hitler's headquarters in Berchtesgaden that a major invasion appeared to be taking place, and asked for the release of the Armoured Reserve, the Panzer Corps, outside Paris. Jodl refused to wake Hitler, and permission was denied. General Bollin, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division, had his tanks ready to move to the coast by 6 a.m., but did not receive permission to do so until late afternoon. Berlin radio reported landings in Normandy at 7 a.m. Schief released its first communiqué announcing the invasion at 9:30 a.m., but not until 10:30 a.m. did word reach Rommel at his home in Heringen. He left immediately for the long drive to Laros, but did not arrive until after dark. The cause of all this mess, beyond complacency and divided command responsibility, was the success of Operation Fortitude. As Max Hastings notes, every key German commander greeted the news of operations in Normandy as evidence of an invasion, not the invasion. The Calvados and Conan coasts were a long way from La Roscogne, a longer way from Paris, and an even longer way from the Pical, and a long, long way from the Rhin-Ruhr industrial heartland. Despite all their post-war claims to the contrary, the Germans just could not believe that the Allies would make their major, much less their sole, landing west of the Seine River. So they decided to wait for the real thing. At the Padal, they were still waiting 3 months later as the Allied armies overran France and moved into Belgium. This was from an army that claimed to be the best and most professional in the world. In fact, from the Supreme Commander in Berchtesgaden down to the field officers in France, to the local commanders in Normandy, and to the men in the barracks at WXYZ, it was an army inferior in all respects except for weaponry, especially the 88 ES and the machine guns, to its Allied opponents. The inferiority was shown again and again on D-Day. At Brehaut Manor at 8:30 a.m., just about the time Sergeant Summers started his attack, Lieutenant Richard Winters and 10 men from E Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment attacked the 50-man guard at the battery of 105 mm guns. The Germans were dug in behind hedgerows. They had extensive interconnecting trenches, machine guns, mortars, and clear fields of fire. Winters's squad, a small group, had 1 light mortar, 2 light machine guns, 2 Tommy guns, and 5 rifles. Although Winters was outnumbered 5-1 and was attacking an entrenched enemy, he and his men prevailed. They did so because they used tactics they had learned in training, plus common sense and some calculated courage. At a cost of 4 dead and 2 wounded, Winters and his men killed 15 Germans, wounded many more, took 12 prisoners, and destroyed 4 German 105 mm cannons. The Americans had done the job through the quickness and audacity of a flanking attack led by Winters, supported by suppressing fire from mortars and machine guns. One factor in their success was that this was their first combat experience. As Sergeant Carwood Lipton said, he took chances that morning he would never take again, but they were so full of fire that day he felt he would not be killed. He felt that if a bullet was headed for him, it would be deflected, or he would move. After destroying the guns, Winters's small group disengaged. Surviving Germans still held the hedgerows around the manor house and were using their machine guns to lay down harassing fire. At about 12 p.m., 2 Sherman tanks came up from the beach. Winters climbed onto the back of the first tank and told the commander to fire along those hedgerows over there and against the manor to clean out anything that was left. The tanks roared ahead. For the tankers, this was their first chance to fire their weapons at the enemy. They had a full load of ammunition for their .50 caliber and .30 caliber machine guns, and for their 75 mm cannon. They just cut those hedgerows to pieces. Lieutenant Harry Welsh of Winters's company remembered, "You thought they would never stop shooting at Harley." Members of the 1st Battalion of the 506th carried out a similar attack and destroyed that battery. Then the 56th drove Colonel Height's battalion out of Saint-Marie-du-Mont. With that, the way was clear for the 4th Infantry Division to move further inland and get on with the war. The 1001st had carried out its main mission, even though at no place were there more than a platoon of men from the same company gathered together. Taylor, Cassidy, Winters, Summers, and many others had seized the initiative and got the job done. The 1001st did not do so well in carrying out its second major mission to secure the southern flank by taking the bridges over the Douve and opening the way to Carentan. This was due to the scattered drop. No sizable force of Americans was able to form up to attack. Colonel Johnson did manage to take the lock at Lorette and establish a small bridgehead on the south bank, but he could not expand it and was pinned down by fire coming from Hayter's paratroopers in Saint-Nom-du-Mont. He had no contact with any other 1001st unit. Captain Sam Gibbons of the 5001st Parachute Infantry, operating independently, led a small patrol towards Saint-Nom-du-Mont. He believed the village was in 1001st hands, but moved cautiously as his visibility was limited by the hedgerows. Before setting out, he shared the 2 cans of beer he had brought with him, then left the empty cans in the middle of the road as a monument to the first cans of Schlitz consumed in France. The patrol reached the bottom of the hill with Saint-Nom-du-Mont sitting at the crest. Gibbons heard a gunbolt move on the other side of a hedgerow. He looked toward the sound and saw a rifle muzzle pointed at him. As he dove for the ditch, all hell broke loose. They had been ambushed. The German behind the hedgerow had his weapon set on full automatic and sprayed bullets all over the area. Instantly, shots started coming from the buildings in Saint-Nom-du-Mont and from the hedges. Gibbons dove to the ground. The German on the other side could not get at him without exposing himself. Gibbons lobbed a grenade over the hedgerow, and the firing stopped. Still, Gibbons could not raise his head, because when he did, he drew fire from the village. His patrol began returning fire, slowly at first, but building up the volume as the men got into firing positions. Gibbons made a dash for a concrete telephone pole, tried to hide behind it, found it did not give him sufficient protection, and made another dash to dive into a ditch. It was deep enough to give him protection as long as he stayed flat on his belly. He began crawling. I had received such a shot of adrenaline I could have crawled a mile. He did not have to go that far. After 50 meters, he found cover and was able to tell his men to slow their fire to conserve ammunition. It was obvious that they were badly outnumbered, and that the Germans were well entrenched and planned to defend Saint-Nom-du-Mont stubbornly. So there they were, 200 yards north of Saint-Nom-du-Mont, meeting superior fire from a major force. They had no automatic weapons, no radios, only their semi-automatic rifles and a few pistols. They hardly knew each other, but they were getting well acquainted and working well together. Gibbons consulted with 2 lieutenants. They decided to break off the action and head north towards Saint-Marie-Glay in search of some friendly force. On the way, they discovered that the beer cans were gone, probably picked up by Height's men at the hamlet of Blosseville. Although firefights, small and big, were going on all around the countryside, everything was quiet. Doors were all closed, windows all shuttered, cows in the field. No one stirred. The firing didn't seem to bother the cows. They just kept on eating. Occasionally one would lift its head and look at them. No one bothered them, so they didn't stop. Gibbons led his patrol towards Saint-Marie-Gleu. Height's paratroopers had beaten off the attack and retained possession of Saint-Nom-du-Mont, which blocked the road to Carentan. That was a significant victory for the Germans, as it kept them in possession of the railway and road bridges over the Douve north of Carentan, which made it possible for them to move reinforcements into the eastern Cotentin. Height was also able to get his 2nd Battalion to the intersection, where the road from Chef Dupont to Saint-Marie-du-Mont crossed the highway from Carentan to Saint-Marie-Gleu. Otherwise, as Height said in 1991, the day did not work out as he expected. His 1st Battalion was forced out of Saint-Marie-du-Mont and pushed south, where many men drowned in the floods around the mouth of the Douve. With the best regiment in Carentan, he was on the defensive, holding crossroads, not launching any coordinated counterattacks. One company of Height's men managed to get a battery of 88 guns at Beaumont working. They opened fire on Colonel Johnson's position at Lorette. Fortunately for Johnson, Lieutenant Farrell, a naval shorefire control officer who had jumped with the 5001st, had, through dogged persistence, found an SCR 6009 radio. With Farrell was Lieutenant Parker Alford, a forward observer for the 1001st Artillery. They tried to contact the cruiser USS Quincy directly, but the Germans jammed the frequency. Alford then discovered that he could reach a shore party at Utah. He asked that it relay a request to Quincy to lay on a barrage against Beaumont. Quincy asked for verification of Alford's identity. He replied that he knew a naval officer who had played linebacker with the Nebraska team in the 1940 Rose Bowl game. Name him. Quincy called back through the shore party. "Easy," Alford replied. "He is Casey Roberts, and he is a member of the shore party we are speaking through." "Roger, Roger, where do you want the fire?" Alford gave the coordinates. Quincy blasted away. Beaumont was obliterated. The 88S fell silent. Captain Shettle's small group from the 3rd Battalion, 56th Parachute Infantry, spent the day isolated at the bridges along the lower Douve. He could not advance. The Germans made no effort to push him back. His only contact with the beach came in the late afternoon, when a platoon-sized German force was seen to the rear. Shettle took about half his force and deployed to ambush the enemy. When the Americans opened fire, the Germans made no attempt to fight back. They threw up their hands and surrendered. They turned out to be a Hungarian labour force fleeing from the beachhead. As the day was ending, a German patrol came after Shettle's group. The Americans threw grenades at them. Shettle jumped up to throw one, forgetting that he had dislocated his right shoulder on a practice jump in May. When I threw my grenade, my shoulder came out of its socket and the grenade landed in my foxhole. Fortunately, the banks of the foxhole protected me. I found that I had blown up my prized Bond Street trench coat, which was much lighter and more protective than our issued heavy rubber gear. This ended the day with very little sleep, worry about our exposed position, a lack of ammunition, and only hard chocolate bars for food. Those hard chocolate bars sustained many American paratroopers on June 6th, but some found they craved real food. Private Herbert James of the 5008th Parachute Infantry Regiment approached a Norman farmer to do some trading. James indicated he wanted eggs, but the farmer did not understand and appeared frightened. So I started making noises like a chicken and hopped around. The farmer thought I wanted a whole chicken and tried to catch one. James shook his head no and made the shape of an egg with his fingers. The farmer got some eggs, and James gave him a chocolate bar in trade. Pleased with the exchange, the farmer called his small daughter from the house and gave her the bar, saying "chocolate, chocolate" over and over. The girl took her first taste of chocolate ever and was delighted. James went back into the woods and poached his eggs on his entrenching shovel, and was delighted. Lieutenant Carl Cartage of the 5001st Parachute Infantry was even luckier. He and a few members of his platoon drove some Germans out of a farmhouse, killing 6 or 7 of them in the process. Inside, Carthage found the dining room table covered with half-eaten food, Norman cheese, apples, cold meats, and cider. After bolting some food, he searched the dead Germans looking for paybooks, unit identification, and the like. To get one paybook, he had to open a dead German's belt buckle. He looked at the Flying Eagle belt buckle, which was inscribed with "Gott MUNs," and said, "The hell he is." Carthage was in the Ville area, northeast of Saint-Nom-du-Mont. There he found his company medic, a man named Anderson, who had been caught by the Germans. As he came down, Anderson was hanging in a tree by his feet, his arms down, throat cut, genitals stuffed in his mouth. His medic's Red Cross armband was stained with the blood that had flowed from his hair. The sight infuriated the Americans, but the Germans were not the only ones to commit atrocities that day. Private William Sawyer of the 5008th remembered running into one of his buddies. We had all been issued yellow HHH gloves. This fellow had on red gloves, and I asked him where he got them. He reached down in his jump pants and pulled out a whole string of ears he had been ear hunting all night, sewn on an old bootlace. About mid-morning, Lieutenant Jack Isaacs of the 55th Parachute Infantry pulled 3 wounded glider-borne Americans into a farmhouse. Shortly thereafter, we noticed a German soldier step out into the field and approach an injured man we had left there, intending to go back for him. The German looked him over and then shot him. That Kraut didn't survive his trip back to the hedgerow. Getting help to the wounded was a major problem. Every trooper carried a first aid kit, but it contained only bandages, sulfur tablets, and 2 morphine tablets. There were only a handful of doctors who jumped with the troops, and they had precious little equipment. Major David Thomas, regimental surgeon for the 5008th, set up his aid station in a ditch near the Muret River. The thing I remember most was a soldier who had his leg blown off right by the knee, with only his patella tendon still attached. I told him, "I'm going to have to cut the rest of your leg off, and you're back to bullet-biting time because I don't have anything to use for an anaesthetic." He said, "Go ahead, Doc." I cut the patella tendon, and he didn't even whimper. The confusion that characterized all airborne operations on June 6th was badly compounded for the 82nd Division because it landed around the Muret River. As a result of the extensive flooding, the Muret was more a shallow lake, a kilometre or more wide and 10 kilometres long, than a river. There were 2 crossings, one a raised road or causeway and bridge at Lafayette, about a kilometre west of St. Mary-Glay, and the other a causeway and bridge at Chef Dupont, 2 kilometres south of Lafayette. The 82nd had hoped to take Lafayette and Chef Dupont during the night, and then spend the day attacking westward to secure the line of the Upper Doubs River. But in the event, the division had a terrific day-long fight for the 2 positions. Many of its units were isolated west of the Murder. Some remained surrounded and isolated for as long as 4 days, fighting off German tank and artillery attacks with their handheld weapons. Shortly after dawn, General James Gavin, Assistant Division Commander of the 82nd, had assembled nearly 300 men, mainly from the 57th Parachute Infantry Regiment, about as large a group as the Americans had that morning. Gavin moved south along the railroad embankment on the edge of the flooded area to Lafayette. He decided that the American position on the east bank of the causeway was secure, left part of his force there, and continued south to Chef Dupont with the remainder. Meanwhile, an 8-man group under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Timms took possession of the hamlet of Canaan at the west end of the Lafayette causeway. When a patrol of 4 officers and 8 enlisted men under Lieutenant Louis Levy of the 007th EPI came into Canaan, Timms decided that the 12-man group could hold the bridgehead. He decided to go on the offensive and moved out with his group toward his original objective. Sergeant Donald Bosworth was a member of Headquarters Company, 1st Battalion, 57th. He had broken his ankle on the jump. With the aid of 5 other men from his company, he managed to get to a farmhouse. The farmer's wife, a school teacher who could speak a little English, invited all the men in and hugged each one of them in turn. Her husband offered Bosworth his small old flatbed truck and dug up a 5-gallon can of gasoline he had buried in the yard. Bosworth and Sergeant A.J. Carlucci signed a receipt for the truck so that the couple could recover its cost from Uncle Sam and set out for Islay. On the way, they joined up with Timmy, a medic who made a splint for Bosworth's ankle. Bosworth stayed in the fight. Timmy sent him to check out a farmhouse on the other side of a hedgerow. As Bosworth started to crawl over the hedgerow, he suddenly came face to face with two Germans not more than 40 yards away. They were setting up a machine gun. It seemed like an hour before any of us moved. Bosworth shot the Germans with his semi-automatic. They shot him. He was hit in the right shoulder, went flying backward off the hedgerow, and lost consciousness. Lieutenant Robert Law got him to the basement of a farmhouse where he spent the rest of the day. Meanwhile, Timmy was unable to penetrate the German defences around Arville. Gavin and Timmy had moved their main force out of Lafire and Kin on the assumption that the small groups they left behind could hold the positions and that they were mutually supporting. But the Germans held the high ground west of the causeway, which was nearly a kilometre long, and they brought the road under highly accurate sniper and mortar fire, preventing the Americans from using it. About mid-morning, the Germans launched a counterattack led by 3 tanks against Kin. Lieutenant Levy and his handful of men fought it off for over an hour. They managed to disable 2 enemy tanks with gammon grenades. How the Yanks loved that British grenade. It was the best anti-tank weapon they had, far superior to their own bazookas if they could get close enough. But eventually they had to withdraw northward. Thus the bridgehead so handily won was lost. The 8 second units were separated, each fighting its own lonely battle on either side of the swollen Murray. Tim's group remained isolated for 2 days. To the south, at Chef Dupont, General Gavin and a group of about 100 men, mainly from 1st Battalion, 57th Parachute Infantry under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Ostberg, moved to seize the bridge about a half-kilometre west of the village. At 10 a.m., Ostberg led his force on a dash through the main street headed for the bridge. The Americans were fired on from several buildings simultaneously, taking 4 casualties. It took nearly 2 hours to systematically clear the village of the enemy. Retreating Germans headed for the bridge. We knew the bridge must be taken before the Germans could organise their defence, Captain Roy Creek recalled, so we made a semi-organised dash for it. We were too late. 2 officers reached the bridge and both were shot, one toppling off the bridge into the water, the other falling on the eastern approach. The officer toppling into the river was Ostberg. He was rescued shortly after and lived to fight again. The other officer was Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Maloney, and some 75 men arrived. We set about dislodging the stubborn enemy, but it proved impossible. The Germans had foxholes dug into the shoulders of the causeway and held the high ground on the west bank. The Americans had only small arms. The Germans had tanks and artillery to supplement their machine gun and mortar fire. 2 attempts to storm the bridge proved unsuccessful. The Germans counterattacked. Private David Jones of the 5008th had just come up to the edge of the causeway. He saw tanks coming across, 3 French Renault tanks, probably the smallest tanks used during the entire war, but to me they were larger than life. The lead tank had its hatch open, and the black-capped tank commander was exposed from the waist up, hands resting outside the turret. He turned to a buddy and said, "I think it's time to get our war started." He took careful aim and fired at the tank commander. His bullet hit the turret, and I can still remember the sound of that ricochet. The black uniform disappeared, the hatch clanged shut, and the tank backed off a few feet. Our little group scattered to the 4 winds. Not only had I missed my first shot of World War II, but I was now confronted with where and how to hide. He found a place in a vegetable garden behind a farmhouse. The tank fired a 20 mm round into the side of the house, and Jones and his group took off running to the nearest hedgerow. The tank moved on towards Chef Dupont, and the other 2 followed. The middle tank stopped in front of the farmhouse. On the 2nd floor, Sergeants Ray Hmel and O.B. Hill were watching. Hill handed Hmel a gam grenade. Just at that moment, Hill remembered the hatch of the tank opened and raised back, and the tank commander climbed up to where his waist was out of the tank, looking around. Hmel dropped the gam grenade right into the tank. There was one awful explosion, smoke and fire all around the tank, and the commander, who was standing in the hatch, went straight up in the air like a champagne cork. The other two tanks turned their guns on the farmhouse and blasted away. The mother and daughter who were in the building downstairs became quite excited and screamed at us to get out. We figured that perhaps we should. Hummel and Hill fled to the nearest hedge, and the tanks withdrew to the west. Now there was a stalemate at the causeway. The Americans could not advance and would not retreat. The German infantry dug in along the causeway could fire but could not move. One of them decided to give up. He rose out of the embankment. S.L.A. Marshall described the scene in his classic book, Night Drop. He called, "Kamerad!" Before anyone could answer, a paratrooper, not more than 20 feet away, shot him dead, within clear view of the people on both sides. Marshall wrote that the shot was terribly stupid. Had the man been allowed to surrender, his companions would have followed his lead. Captain Creek, who witnessed this action at close range, commented, "I would defy anyone to make a split-second judgment on what to do when an enemy soldier jumps up out of a foxhole 20 feet from you in the heat of heavy firing on both sides, and in your very first fight for your life." To this day, 47 years later, I don't know if the enemy soldier was trying to surrender or not. In my opinion, any enemy shot during this intense action had waited too long to surrender. He was as committed as the attacker to a fight for survival. Shortly thereafter, around mid-afternoon, General Gavin, who had gone back to Lafayette, sent word for Colonel Maloney to bring his men and join him there. This left Creek in command of 34 men, with orders from Gavin to hold Chef Dupont at all costs. It was pretty obvious that it couldn't cost too much, but at the same time it was doubtful we could hold something we didn't have. Making matters worse, Creek saw a line of German infantry approaching from his left rear, while a German field piece began firing from across the river. Then, as if from heaven, C-47S began to appear, dropping bundles of weapons and ammunition. One bundle of 60 mm mortar ammunition dropped right in our laps. Next came a glider-delivered 57 mm anti-tank gun. Creek turned the mortars on the German infantry and used the AT gun to fire at the German field piece on the west bank of the causeway. We didn't hit it, I am certain, but we stopped it from firing. Creek went over to the offensive. A 10-man patrol began to dash across the causeway. 5 German infantrymen jumped up from their foxholes along the embankment and made a run for it. They were shot down. The others surrendered. "That did it," Creek said. "The bridge was ours, and we knew we could hold it." But as with all victors in war, we shared a let-down feeling. We knew it was still a long way to Berlin. Creek set about organizing and improving the position, tending to the wounded, gathering up the dead German and American soldiers, and covering them with parachutes. Darkness was approaching. When would the beach forces come? They should have already done so. Maybe the whole invasion had failed. All we knew was the situation in Chef Dupont. Chef Dupont is a very small town. At 12 o'clock a.m. our fears were dispelled. Reconnaissance elements of the 4th Infantry Division wheeled into town and shared their rations with us. It was D-Day +1 in Normandy. As I sat pondering the day's events, I reflected upon the details of the fighting and the bravery of every man participating in it. We had done some things badly, but overall, with a hodgepodge of troops from several units who had never trained together and didn't even know one another, engaged in their first combat, we had done okay. We captured our bridge and we held it. St. Mary Gley was a quiet little village with a couple of hundred grey stone houses. The town square, built around a grey Norman church, contained the usual Norman shops selling eggs, cheese, meat, dresses and suits, cider and wine, newspapers, bread, and a pharmacy. It had a hotel, a devil, and a hospital. It was a village in which nothing much of consequence had happened for 10 centuries. The most exciting times were the festivals and weddings. The N13 ran through the village, heading north to Cherbourg, south to Carentan, then east to KH and on to Paris. Without the use of the N13, the Germans to the north of Saint-Mary-Gley would be cut off. Without control of Saint-Mary-Gley, the American paratroopers along and beyond the Mer would be cut off, and the 4th Infantry Division would be unable to move west and north. Thus, the battle for St. Mary Gley took on an importance out of all proportion to the intrinsic value of the village. The staff of the 82nd Airborne had agreed during the planning stage of the invasion that the place would be the division's defensive base if the 4th Infantry failed to gain a foothold or if the link-up was delayed. All the division's units would fall back on St. Mary Gley until relieved. The village had to be held for an additional reason. The second flight of gliders was scheduled to land around the village just before dusk. The 3rd Battalion, 55th PIR, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss, had taken possession of the town just before daylight. Lieutenant James Cole of Headquarters Company was with Krauss. Coyle recalled a Frenchman who came out of his house to talk. He spoke little or no English, and I spoke but a little French, but I understood him well enough to sense his concern. He wanted to know if this was a raid, or if it was the invasion. Coyle reassured him, saying, "We are staying here. We are not leaving St. Mary Gley." Private John Fitzgerald of the 5002P, who had been misdropped, came into town at dawn. He saw troopers hanging in trees. They looked like rag dolls, shot full of holes, their blood dripping on the place. On the edge of town, Fitzgerald saw a sight that has never left my memory. It was a picture story of the death of one 82nd Airborne trooper. He had occupied a German foxhole and made it his personal Alamo. In a half-circle around the hole lay the bodies of 9 German soldiers. The body closest to the hole was only 3 feet away, a potato masher grenade in its fist. The other distorted forms lay where they had fallen, testimony to the ferocity of the fight. His ammunition bandoliers were still on his shoulders, empty of M1 clips. Cartridge cases littered the ground. His rifle stock was broken in 2. He had fought alone, and like many others that night, he had died alone. I looked at his dog tags. The name read Martin V. Hearse. I wrote the name down in a small prayer book I carried, hoping someday I would meet someone who knew him. I never did. Colonel Vandervoort, despite his broken ankle, was moving his battalion, the 2nd of the 500th, towards St. Mary Gley. His mission was to guard the northern approaches to the village. He therefore detached the 3rd Platoon of D Company, Lieutenant Turner Turnbull commanding, and sent it to Nouillow-Plan with orders to set up a defence there. Vandervoort entered St. Mary Gley, where he got lucky. There was a glider-delivered jeep in good working order, which allowed Vandervoort to get out of his wheelbarrow and become more mobile. He conferred with Krauss, who had shrapnel wounds in his leg. They agreed that Vandervoort would be responsible for the eastern and northern sides of the village, while Krauss would cover the southern and western ends. They did not have enough men to set up an all-around perimeter defence, but they could block the roads. Vandervoort had another piece of luck. Captain Alfred Ireland of the 80th Airborne Anti-Aircraft Battalion, who had come in by glider shortly after dawn, reported that he had 2 working 57 MM-80 guns. Commenting later on his ride into Normandy and the crash landing of his glider, Paratrooper Ireland said of the glider-borne troops, "Those guys don't get paid enough." That was literally true. The glider troops did not get the extra $1.50 per month jump pay that the paratroopers received. Vandervoort set up one of the AT guns at the northern end of St. Mary Gley and sent the other north to Nouillow-Plan to support Turnbull. Turnbull was half Cherokee. His men called him Chief, but not in his presence. He was a good guy. Private Charles Miller remembered, "I used to box with him." Turnbull had put 2 of his squads along a hedge row to the east of Nouillow-Plan and the 3rd to the west. Set up the AT gun in town, pointing north, then talked to Turnell, who reported that nothing much had happened since he set up around 4 hours earlier. It was now about 1 p.m. While they were talking, a Frenchman rode his bicycle up to them and announced in English that some American paratroopers were bringing in a large contingent of German prisoners from the north. Sure enough, when Vandervoort and Turnbull looked in that direction, they saw a column of troops marching in good order right down the middle of the N13, with what appeared to be paratroopers on either side of them, waving orange flags. the American recognition signal on June 6th. But Vandervoort grew suspicious when he noticed two tracked vehicles at the rear of the column. He told Turnbull to have his machine gunner fire a short burst just to the right of the approaching column, which by now was less than a kilometre away. The burst scattered the column, and prisoners and paratroopers alike dove into the ditches and returned fire. The Frenchman pedalled madly away, and the two self-propelled guns that had aroused Vandervoort's suspicion began to move forward behind smoke canisters. At a half-kilometre, the SPs opened fire. One of the first shots knocked out Turnbull's bazooka team. Another was a near miss on the American AT gun. Its crew scattered, but with some encouragement from Vandervoort, the gunners manned the AT gun and with some fast and accurate shooting put the German SPs out of action. However, the German infantry, a full-strength company from the 91st Lieutenant Colonel Lunder Division, began moving around Turnbull's flanks, using hedgerows for cover. Vandervoort saw that Turnbull would be overrun quickly without reinforcements, so he had his jeep driver take him back to St. Mary Galais, where he dispatched Lieutenant Theodore Peterson and Lieutenant Coyle with the 1st Platoon of E Company to go to Neuville to cover Turnbull's withdrawal. Meanwhile, Turnbull was extending his lines to the east and west to force the Germans to make a wider flanking move. By 4 p.m., he had almost run out of men and room. He was taking heavy casualties, primarily from accurate German mortar fire. Of the 23 men he had led into Neuville, only 16 were in condition to fight, and some of them were wounded. 9 of Turnbull's men were dead. Turnbull was prepared to make a last stand, a sort of Custer at the Little Big Horn in reverse, when the platoon medic, Corporal James Kelly, volunteered to stay behind and look after the wounded. Private Julius Sebastien, Corporal Ray Smithson, and Sergeant Robert Nyand offered to form a rear guard to cover the retreat of the remainder of the platoon. As Turnbull began the retreat, E Company moved into Neuville. "Plan, we hit fast and hard," Sergeant Otis Sampson recalled. He was handling the mortar and was skilled at it. He began placing shells right in the middle of the German force coming in on the flank. The Germans were trying to move some men from the left of a lane to the right, one man at a time. Sampson judged when another would cross and had another round put in the tube. The timing was perfect. Sampson kept moving his mortar around to avoid becoming a target. The rifle squads maintained a steady fire, and the momentum of the German advance was halted. Meanwhile, Lieutenants Peterson and Coyle took a patrol to meet Turnbull and the few men he had left with him. They started their journey back to St. Mary Galais. Sampson said, "I could hear the Jerrys yelling as we were leaving. It reminded me of an unfinished ball game, and they were yelling for us to come back and finish it. We withdrew in a casual way, as one would after a day's work. I walked alongside Lieutenant Turnbull. He was a good man." The 28 badly wounded men left behind and 2 of the 3 volunteers who provided a rear guard were captured. The 3rd volunteer, Sergeant Bob Nyand, was killed at his machine gun. One of his brothers, a platoon leader in the 4th Division, was killed the same morning at Utah Beach. Another brother was killed that week in B. Mama Mrs. Nyand received all 3 telegrams from the War Department announcing the deaths of her sons on the same day. Her 4th son, Fritz, was in the 101st Airborne and was pulled out of the front line by the army. The most critical of the wounded were evacuated to a hospital in Cherbourg by the Germans and were eventually freed when that city was taken on June 27th. The others were freed on the night of June 7th, 8, when American tanks overran Neuville. Turnbull was killed in St. Mary Galais on June 7th by an artillery round. Turnbull's heroic stand allowed Krauss and Vandervoort to concentrate on an even stronger counterattack from the 795th Regiment south of St. Mary Galais. It was as big a counterattack as the Germans mounted on D-Day, and was supported by 88 guns firing from high ground south of the village. The impact of the shells threw up mounds of dirt and mud. Private Fitzgerald recalled, "The ground trembled and my eardrums felt as if they would burst. Dirt was filling my shirt and getting into my eyes and mouth." Those 88s became a legend. It was said that more soldiers were converted to Christianity by the 88s than by Peter and Paul combined. When the firing finally stopped, it was mid-afternoon. We still held the town, and there was talk of tanks coming up from the beaches to help us. I could not hold a razor still enough to shave for the next few days. Up until now, I had been mentally on the defensive. My introduction to combat had been a shocker, but it was beginning to wear off. I found myself angry at the Germans, the dirt, the noise, and the idea of being pushed back. Others felt the same when Colonel Kraus sent E Company to strike at the enemy flank. It moved out aggressively, caught a German convoy in the open, and with bazookas and GAM bombs destroyed some tanks. The accompanying German infantry withdrew under a hail of fire. With the last light of day, Fitzgerald said, "The last German attack came to a halt." Reinforcements came in by glider. They tried to land all around St. Mary Gley, but the pilots were taking small arms fire from the surrounding Germans. In any case, the fields were too short and the hedgerows too high. Every glider seemed to end up crashing into a hedgerow. I was standing in a ditch when a glider suddenly came crashing through some trees. Lieutenant Coyle remembered, "I had not seen it coming and of course could not hear it as it made no sound. I just had time to drop face down in the ditch when the glider hit, crashed across the road, and came to rest with its wing over me. I had to crawl on my stomach the length of the wing to get out from under." Sergeant Sampson dove to the ground as a glider crashed into a hedgerow. The tail end of the glider was sticking up at a 45 degrees angle. I went to see if I could help. As I came up, a hole started to appear on the right side of the glider. The men were kicking out an exit like bees from a hive. They came out of that hole, jumped on the ground, ran for the trees, and disappeared. I tried to tell them they were in friendly country, but they passed me as if I wasn't even there. During the night, the Germans were firing flares, shooting rifles, mortars, and occasionally 88s at St. Mary Gley, yelling out orders and threats at the Americans. They seemed to be so sure of themselves. Sampson said, "A barrage would hit us, and then they would open up with their machine pistols, yelling as if to attack. Then it would quiet down and burst out anew." I snuggled up close to my mortar and caressed the barrel. How I wanted to fire it, but we were too intermingled. I might have hit some of our own men. The enemy never came on. Maybe they thought with all their yelling and firing we would give our positions away by running. I wondered what had happened at the beaches. The infantry should have been with us by now. Many things ran through my mind. I was afraid the invasion had been a failure. I was thinking of my country and the people we were trying to help. I was almost certain I would never see daylight again. I can't say I was afraid. I just wanted a chance to take as many Jerrys with me as possible. I wanted them to come where I could see them. I wanted to see a pile of them in front of me before they got me. It would have been so much easier dying that way. St. Mary Gley was secure, if barely. The official history records this as the most significant operation of the 82nd Airborne Division on D-Day. Another victory for the 82nd had been won by Captain Creek at Chef Dupont on the west side of the Muderette. However, the bulk of the 82nd was scattered in small, isolated pockets, surrounded and fighting for survival rather than seizing objectives. Communication between units was almost non-existent. General Ridgway feared that his division might be destroyed before it could consolidate and before the 4th Infantry reached it to the east. Toward the beaches, the 1001st had opened the causeways and linked up with the seaborne American troops. Many of its men were unaccounted for. Of the 6,600 troopers of the 1001st who had dropped into Normandy during the night, only 2,500 were fighting together in some kind of organized unit at the end of the day. Some of its units, like Colonel Johnson's at La Roquette and Captain Shettle at the Lower Deux Bridges, were isolated and vulnerable. But the 1001st had accomplished its main mission, opening the way inland for the 4th Infantry. The casualty rate cannot be stated with accuracy. The airborne records for Normandy do not distinguish between D-Day losses and those suffered in the ensuing weeks. It was perhaps 10%, which was much lower than Air Vice Marshal Lee Mallory had feared and predicted, but incredibly high for one day of combat. It would almost seem to have been too high a price, except that thanks to the airborne, the 4th Division got ashore and inland with an absolute minimum of casualties. That was the payoff for the largest night drop of paratroopers ever made. Lee Mallory had urged Eisenhower to cancel the airdrop and bring the airborne divisions into the beaches as follow-up troops. Eisenhower had refused, and he was surely right. Without the airborne fighting behind the German lines, the 4th Infantry would probably have gotten ashore and over the sand dunes without too much difficulty, as the German defenders on the shoreline were too few and of poor quality and were badly battered by the marauders. But getting across the causeways over the flooded area back from the dunes would have been costly, perhaps impossible, without the airborne. The 1001st had accomplished 2 critical missions. Its men had taken the exit from the rear and had knocked out German cannons at Bort Manor, Holdy, and other places. Cannons that could have been used with deadly effectiveness against the infantry and landing craft. General Marshall had urged Eisenhower to drop the airborne much further inland, as much as 60 colons from the beach. Eisenhower had refused, reasoning that lightly armed paratroopers far behind German lines would have been more of a liability than a help, isolated and vulnerable, unable to act aggressively. The experience of the 82nd Airborne west of the Muderet would seem to show that Eisenhower was right. If the Germans were going to stop the invasion anywhere, it would be at Omaha Beach. It was an obvious landing site, being the only sand beach between the mouth of the Dove to the west and Arromanches to the east, a distance of almost 40 kilometres. On both ends of Omaha, the cliffs were more or less perpendicular. The sand at Omaha Beach is golden in colour, firm and fine, perfect for sunbathing and picnicking. However, the beach is constricted and slightly crescent-shaped, about 10 kilometres long overall. At low tide, there is a stretch of firm sand 300 to 400 metres in distance. At high tide, the distance from the waterline to the 1 to 3 metre bank of shingle, small round stones, is only a few metres. In 1944, the shingle, now mostly gone, was impassable to vehicles. On the western third of the beach, beyond the shingle, there was a part wood, part masonry seawall from 1 to 4 metres in height, now gone. Inland of the seawall, there was a paved promenade beach road, then a V-shaped anti-tank ditch as much as 2 metres deep, followed by a flat, swampy area, and then a steep bluff that ascended 30 metres or more. A man could climb the bluff, but a vehicle could not. The grass-covered slopes appeared featureless from a distance, but actually contained many small folds or irregularities that proved critical in the battlefield. There were 5 small draws or ravines that sloped gently up to the tableland above the beach. A paved road led off the beach at exit D1 to Vierville and Le Moulin. Exit D3 had a dirt road leading up to Saint-Laurent. Exit E1 had only a path leading up to the tableland. Exit E3 had a dirt road leading to Coville, and the last draw had a dirt path at exit F1. No tactician could have devised a better defensive situation. A narrow, enclosed battlefield with no possibility of outflanking, many natural obstacles for the attacker to overcome, and an ideal place to build fixed fortifications, and a trench system on the slope of the bluff and on the high ground looking down on a wide-open killing field for any infantry trying to cross no man's land. The Allied planners hated the idea of assaulting Omaha Beach, but it had to be done. This was as obvious to Roosevelt as it was to Eisenhower. Both commanders recognized that if the Allies invaded Normandy, they would have to include Omaha Beach in the landing sites. Otherwise, the gap between Utah and the British beaches would be too great. The waters offshore were heavily mined, as were the beaches. The promenade, which also had concertina wire along its length, and the bluff had more beach obstacles than at Utah. Rummel had placed 12 strong points holding 88s, 75s, and mortars, along with dozens of tow-brooks and machine-gun pillboxes supported by an extensive trench system. Everything the Germans had learned in World War I about stopping a frontal assault by infantry, Rummel put to work at Omaha. He laid out firing positions at angles to the beach to cover the tidal flat and beach shelf with crossing fire, plunging fire, and grazing fire from all types of weapons. Artillery positions were prepared along the cliffs at either end of the beach, capable of delivering enfilade fire from 88s across Omaha. The trench system included underground quarters and magazines connected by tunnels. The strong points were concentrated near the entrances to the draws, which were further protected by large cement roadblocks. The larger artillery pieces were protected by concrete wing walls. There was not 1 inch of the beach that had not been prepared for both grazing and plunging fire. Watching the American landing craft approach, the German defenders could hardly believe their eyes. "Holy smoke, here they are," Lieutenant Firking declared. "But that's not possible. That's not possible." He put down his binoculars and rushed to his command post in a bunker near Vierville. Landing craft on their left, off Vierville, were making for the beach. Corporal Hinseo in Bunker 62 called out, "They must be crazy." Sergeant Cron declared, "Are they going to swim ashore right under our muzzles?" The colonel of the artillery regiment passed down a strict order. "Hold your fire until the enemy is coming up to the waterline." All along the bluff, German soldiers watched the landing craft approach, their fingers on the triggers of machine guns, rifles, artillery fuses, or holding mortar rounds. In Bunker 62, Firking was on the telephone giving the range to gunners a couple of kilometres inland. "Target Dora, all guns range 4850, basic direction 20 plus impact fuse." Captain Robert Walker of Headquarters Company, 116th Regiment, 29th Division, later described the defences in front of Vierville. The cliff-like ridge was covered with well-concealed foxholes and many semi-permanent bunkers. The bunkers were practically unnoticeable from the front, with their firing openings toward the flank so they could bring flanking crossfire to the beach, as well as all the way up the slope of the bluff. The bunkers had diagrams of fields of fire framed under glass and mounted on the walls beside the firing platforms. A.J. Leibling, who covered the invasion for the New Yorker, climbed the bluff a few days after D-Day. He wrote that the trenches were deep, narrow, and convoluted, so an attacking force at any point could be fired on from several directions. Important knots in the system, like the command post and mortar placements, were of concrete. The command post was sunk at least 25 feet into the ground and faced with brick on the inside. The garrison slept in underground bomb-proofs with timbered ceilings and wooden floors. To a civilian, it looked like a regular Maginot Line. 4 things gave the Allies the notion that they could successfully assault this all but impregnable position. First, Allied intelligence said the fortifications and trenches were manned by the 716th Infantry Division, a low-quality unit made up of Poles and Russians with poor morale. At Omaha, intelligence estimated there was only 1 battalion of about 800 troops to man the defences. Second, the B-17s assigned to the air bombardment would hit the beach with everything they had, destroying or at least neutralizing the bunkers and creating craters on the beach and bluff that would be usable as foxholes for the infantry. Third, the naval bombardment, culminating with the LCT's rockets, would finish off anything left alive and moving after the B-17s finished. The infantry from the 29th and 1st Divisions going into Omaha were told that their problems would begin when they got to the top of the bluff and started to move inland toward their D-Day objectives. Fourth, 40,000 men with 3,500 motorized vehicles were scheduled to land at Omaha on D-Day. In the event none of the above worked, the intelligence was wrong. Instead of the contemptible 716th Division, the quite capable 352nd Division was in place. Instead of 1 German battalion to cover the beach, there were 3. The cloud cover and late arrival caused the B-17S to delay their release until they were as much as 5 kilometers inland. Not a single bomb fell on the beach or bluff. The naval bombardment was too brief and generally inaccurate, concentrating on the big fortifications above the bluff. Finally, most of the rockets fell short, landing in the surf and killing thousands of fish, but no Germans. Captain Walker on an LCI recalled that just before H-hour he took a look towards the shore and his heart sank. He couldn't believe how peaceful, untouched and tranquil the scene was. The terrain was green, all buildings and houses were intact, the church steeples stood proudly and defiantly. He yelled to no one in particular, Is the damned Air Corps? The Overlord plan for Omaha was elaborate and precise. It had the 116th Regiment of the 29th Division attached to the 1st Division for this day only, going in on the right, west, supported by C Company of the 2nd Ranger Battalion. The 8th Regiment of the 1st Division would go in on the left. It would be a linear attack, with the two regiments going in by companies abreast. There were 8 sectors from right to left, named Charlie, Dog Green, Dog White, Dog Red, Easy Green, Easy Red, Fox Green, and Fox Red. The 116th sectors ran from Charlie to Easy Green. The first waves would consist of 2 battalions from each regiment landing in a column of companies, with the 3rd Battalion coming in behind. Assault teams would cover every inch of beach, firing M1S, .30 caliber machine guns, BRs, bazookas, 60 mm mortars, and flamethrowers. Ahead of the assault teams would be DD tanks, Navy underwater demolition teams, and Army engineers. Each assault team and the supporting units had specific tasks to perform, all geared to opening the exits. As the infantry suppressed whatever fire the Germans could bring to bear, the demolition teams would blow the obstacles and mark the paths through them with flags, so that as the tide came in, the coxswains would know where it was safe to go. Next would come the following waves of landing craft, bringing in reinforcements on a strict schedule designed to put firepower ranging from M1s to 105mm howitzers into the battle exactly when needed, plus more tanks, trucks, jeeps, medical units, traffic control personnel, headquarters communication units, and all the physical support and administrative control required by 2 overstrength divisions of infantry conducting an all-out offensive. By H/120 minutes, the vehicles would be driving up the opened draws to the top of the bluff and starting to move inland toward their D-Day objectives. First of all, the villages of Vierville, Saint-Laurent, and Coville, then heading west toward Perrier-du-Ault or south to take Trevière, 8 kilometers from Omaha. Eisenhower's little aphorism that plans are everything before the battle, useless once it is joined, was certainly the case at Omaha. Nothing worked according to the plan, which was indeed useless the moment the Germans opened fire on the assault forces. With the exception of Company A6TF, no unit landed where it was supposed to. Half of E Company was more than a kilometre off target, the other half more than 2 kilometres to the east of its assigned sector. This was a consequence of winds and tides. A northwest wind of 10 to 18 knots created waves of 3 to 4 feet, sometimes as much as 6 feet, which pushed the landing craft from right to left. The tidal current, with the rising tide, dead low tide at Omaha was 5:25 a.m., ran at a velocity of 2.7 knots. By H hour, not only were the boats out of position, but the men in them were cramped, seasick, and miserable. Most had climbed down their rope nets into the craft 4 hours or more earlier. The waves came crashing over the gunwales of every LCVP and LCA landing craft, the British version of the Higgins boat, causing most of them to ship water. In most of them, the pumps could not carry the load, so the troops had to bail with their helmets. At least 10 of the 200 boats in the first wave swamped. Most of the troops were picked up later by Coast Guard rescue craft, often after hours in the water. Many drowned. Another disheartening sight to the men in the surviving boats was the glimpse of GIs struggling in life preservers and on rafts. Personnel from the foundered DD tanks in general were exhausted and confused even before the battle began. Still, the misery caused by the spray hitting them in the face with each wave and by their seasickness was such that they were eager to hit the beach, feeling that nothing could be worse than riding on those damned Higgins boats. The only comforting thing was the tremendous naval shells zooming over their heads, but even they were hitting the top of the bluff or further inland, not the beach or the slope. At H+5 minutes, the fire lifted. Chief Electrician's mate Alfred Sears was in the last LCVP of 16 in the first wave going in. The ensign had told him, "All the German strong points will be knocked out by the time we hit the beach." Sears went on, "We were so confident of this that on the way in, most of my men and I were sitting on top of the engine room decking of the landing craft, enjoying the show, fascinated by the barrage from the rocket ships. About 1,000 rockets shattered the beach directly where they were to land. It looked pretty good. Lieutenant Joe Smith was a Navy beachmaster. His job was to put up flags to guide the landing craft from Company A, 116th Regiment. His Higgins boat may have been the first to hit the beach. "The Germans let us alone on the beach," he said. "We didn't know why. We could see the Germans up there looking down on us. It was a weird feeling. We were right in front of a German 88 gun emplacement, but fortunately for us they were set to cover down the beach and not toward the sea, so they could not see us." A Higgins boat carrying an assault team from Company A came in behind Smith. The men in it figured that what they had been told to expect had come true. The air and naval bombardments had wiped out the opposition. The ramp went down. "Target Dora! Fire!" Lieutenant Firking shouted into the telephone when the battery opened fire. Throughout the area, the troops pulled their triggers. To the left, there were 3 MG-42 positions to his front, a fortified mortar position on the forward slopes of the bluff, and infantrymen in trenches. They exploded into action. "We hit the sandbar," Electrician's mate Sears recalled. "We dropped the ramp, and then all hell broke loose on us." The soldiers in the boat received a hail of machine gun bullets. The army lieutenant was immediately killed, shot through the head. In the lead company, a boat, LCA 1015, Captain Taylor and all of his men were killed before the ramp went down. The boat just vaporized. No one ever learned whether it was the result of hitting a mine or getting hit by an 88. They put their ramp down, Navy Beachmaster Lieutenant Joe Smith said of what he saw, and a German machine gun or two opened up. You could see the sand kick up right in front of the boat. No one moved. The coxswain stood up and yelled, and for some reason everything was quiet for an instant. You could hear him as clear as a bell. He said, "For Christ's sake, fellas, get out. I've got to go get another load." All across the beach, German machine guns were hurling fire of monstrous proportions at the hapless Americans. One gunner with Lieutenant Firking at strong point 62 fired 12,000 rounds that morning. Due to the misplaced landings, the GIs were bunched together with large gaps between groups, up to a kilometre in length, which allowed the Germans to concentrate their fire. As the Higgins boats and larger LCIs approached the beach, German artillery fired at will from the towbrooks, fortifications up the drawers, and from the implements on the beach. Motor machinist Charles J.R.O. of the Coast Guard was on LCI 994. His skipper was an old man of 32 years, a merchant mariner who did things his own way. His nickname was Popeye. He had stashed a supply of J&B Scotch aboard and told the cook that his duty that day was to go around to the crew and keep giving them a drink until they didn't want any more, or until we ran out. Essentially, we drank most of the day. We didn't have any food, but I drank all day and didn't get the least bit intoxicated. It had absolutely no effect. LCI 994 was in the first wave, right behind the Navy demolition teams and the beach marking crew. By this time it was getting pretty hot. Popeye looked at our sign and said, "Hell, I'm not going in there. We'll never get off that beach." So he aborted the run. The rest of the LCIs in our flotilla went in where they were supposed to go, and none of them got off the beach. They were all shot up. This made our skipper go up in our esteem by a lot. Popeye cruised down the beach about 100 metres, turned toward shore, dropped his stern anchor, and went in at 1/3 speed until he ran aground about 20 metres offshore. The ramps went down, and the men from the 116th moved down them. As they disembarked, the ship lightened. Popeye had his engines put into reverse, used the small Briggs and Stratton motor to pull on the anchor chain, and backed off. 5 men from his 26-man crew were dead, killed by machine gun fire. 20 of the 200 infantrymen were killed before they reached the beach. Private John Barnes of Company A, 116th, was in an LCA as it approached the shoreline abreast with 11 other craft. Someone shouted, "Take a look. This is something that you will tell your grandchildren if we live." Barnes thought ahead. He could see the single spire of the church at Ville. Company A was right on target. The LCA roared ahead, breasting the waves. Suddenly a swirl of water wrapped around his ankles, and the front of the craft dipped down. The water quickly reached their waists, and they shouted to the other boats on each side. They waved in return. Their boat fell away below them. Barnes squeezed the CO2 tube in his lifebelt. The buckle broke, and it popped away. He turned to grab the back of the man behind him, climbing onto his back and pulling himself up in a panic. Heads bobbed above the water. They could see the other boats moving off toward shore. Some men had wrapped Mae Wests around their weapons and inflated them. Barnes saw a rifle floating by, then a flamethrower with 2 Mae Wests around it. He hugged it tight, but still seemed to be going down. He couldn't keep his head above the surface. He tried to pull the release straps on his jacket, but he couldn't move. Lieutenant Gearing grabbed his jacket and used his bayonet to cut the straps and release him from the weight. Barnes was all right now. He could swim. The assault team was about 1 kilometre offshore. Sergeant L wanted to swim in, but Lieutenant Gearing said no. They would wait and get picked up by some passing boat, but none would stop. The coxswain's orders were to go on in and leave the rescue work to others. After a bit, they heard a friendly shout from a limey voice in one of the LCAs. The boat was empty. The man from the Empire Javelin helped them climb aboard. He wouldn't return to the beach. They asked how the others made out. He said he had dropped them off okay. They went back to the Empire Javelin, which they had left at 4:00 a.m. It seemed like just minutes, but when they thought to ask, it was 1 p.m. Barnes and his assault team were extraordinarily lucky. About 60% of the men of Company A came from one town, Bedford, Virginia. For Bedford, the first 15 minutes at Omaha was an unmitigated disaster. Companies G and F were supposed to come in to the immediate left of Company A, but they drifted 1 kilometre further east before landing, so all the Germans around the heavily defended Veal Draw concentrated their fire on Company A. When the ramps on the Higgins boats dropped, the Germans just poured machine gun, artillery and mortar fire on them. It was a slaughter. Of the 200-plus men of the company, only a couple of dozen survived, and virtually all of them were wounded. Sergeant Thomas Vallance survived barely. As they came down the ramp, they were in water about knee-high and started to do what they were trained to do, move forward and then crouch and fire. One problem was they didn't quite know what to fire at. Vallance saw some tracers coming from a concrete emplacement that looked mammoth. He never anticipated any gun emplacements being that big. He shot at it, but there was no way he was going to knock out a German concrete emplacement with a .30 caliber rifle. The tide was coming in rapidly, and the men around Vallance were getting hit. He found it difficult to stay on his feet. Like most infantrymen, he was badly overloaded, soaking wet, exhausted, trying to struggle through wet sand and avoid obstacles with mines attached to them. He abandoned his equipment, which was dragging him down into the water. It became evident quickly that they weren't going to accomplish very much. Vallance remembered floundering in the water with his hand up in the air, trying to get his balance when he was first shot through the palm of his hand, then through the knuckle. Private Henry Witt was rolling over toward him. Vallance remembered him saying, "Sergeant, they're leaving us here to die like rats, just to die like rats."